For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Riddell and I'm a professor in the English department at Bishop's. And today I'm going to talk about how to write a research paper. So the difference between a research paper and a non-research paper is both simple, insofar as one uses research and one doesn't, and yet complex. So a non-research paper, you guys have all written or been expected to write these kinds of papers in your first year classes. They are you and the text. You are engaging with the text, you are looking at the analysis of textual evidence, you're coming up with your own argument, and you're writing a relatively short paper, right? So 4 to 6 pages. A research paper is quite different. It's a much more complicated juggling act. So it involves a few things. It involves a few steps. The first one is familiarizing yourself with the works of experts, okay? So what are these experts and why are they important? You're going to look at things like their scholarly articles from academic journals. You're going to look at academic books or book chapters from edited collections. You're going to look at peer-reviewed secondary sources written by people who have PhDs who are experts in the field. And then not only are you going to look at those things and familiarize yourself with the research, you're also going to position yourself in a conversation with these experts. So you're going to compare and contrast your perspectives, your ideas, and your arguments with the work of these experts or scholars. It is best to limit, and this is an expectation of most of your professors, it's best to limit your research to the last 20 years. So it's not great if your bibliography is filled with old guys from 1934, because the way in which they approach the scholarship has been discussed and refuted and added to in the last 70 or 80 years. So you really want to look at the last 20 years of scholarship. There are a few exceptions to this. You're going to come across some canonical authors, some really, really important foundational texts in the field or in the topic that you've chosen to discuss. So for example, if you're looking at identity and performance in Shakespeare's work, you've got to go look at Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance Self-Fashioning. It was written in the early 1980s, but it's something that everybody now still refers to. And so you'll find people writing articles in 2010 or 2012 still going back to Stephen Greenblatt. So it's really important for you to familiarize yourself with these foundational texts. So that's the exception to limiting your scholarship to the last 20 years. I want you to note very well, and pay attention to this, your professors have probably emphasized this several times, but a cursory search that you undergo with Google is not going to really give you the results that you're looking for, especially if you find Wikipedia sites, especially if you find gradesaver.com. They don't constitute viable academic sources because they're not peer-reviewed. So it's really problematic if you guys are citing an undergraduate essay or a master's thesis as your secondary source. These aren't experts in the field, they haven't mastered it, and for the most part haven't had a peer-reviewed publication. Okay, so how do you place yourself within the critical chorus? Do you guys know what I mean by the critical chorus? A chorus is a collection of people with voices, right? So the critical chorus are the voices that are discussing your topic or your text or your field. So that is the critical chorus. It's made up of all these different experts and scholars. And you are one of those scholars. You're one of those experts. And so you have to position yourself within this chorus. You have to not only sing with the choir, but also direct this choir of voices. This means that you don't accept any view straightforwardly, you don't accept any view as evidence, and you don't cite what a scholar says as the truth. So when people first embark on writing research essays, they'll often say, Stephen Greenblatt says da-da-da-da-da. They quote, they provide a page number, and they take that as the spoken word. That is true, he agrees with me, he agrees with my perspective, and I'm then going to move on. And that is a really reductive approach to using secondary sources. They're not unequivocal evidence. And I would like you to remember that your point of view is as valuable as Stephen Greenblatt's. The difference is he's had a few more years of university, He's a professor at Harvard and he has a Pulitzer Prize. Small differences. You have your own critical voice that you are going to develop, and you have to develop this confidence and this autonomy in your perspective. When you go and read these secondary sources, you read them with a skeptical eye. You read them with a question mark in your head. You say, does that make sense? Does that follow with the argument that they make? Does the analysis of the evidence actually fulfill the statements? You are asking questions critically. You are not saying, oh my God, Stephen Greenblatt is so amazing, he just blew my mind, which he will, because he's really cool. But you're also going to ask, what is he not saying? Or do I really agree with this particular thing? So as you go through and you read your secondary sources, you should be putting question marks in. You should be offering an alternative perspective. You should be really reading with a critical eye. There's one exception to this rule of treating some research skeptically. And that's when your secondary source, your scholar, actually looks at evidence from archival research. So they have to go into the bowels of the British Library and look at these incredible 14th century manuscripts. Unfortunately, as undergraduates, you don't get to do that, although I highly recommend you do that at some point in your careers. It's amazing. But they're going to find all sorts of documentary evidence. They're going to find other kinds of primary sources that you can use in order to back up your argument. So you can use those things as evidence. You can borrow their work, their archival research. But when they interpret that evidence, that's where you're skeptical. That's where you're going to treat that with some skepticism. Okay, so where do you put your secondary sources as you write your essay? They show up in 3 different places. They show up in your essay in the first paragraph. They show up throughout your essay, and they show up in your footnotes. Okay? So these are the 3 places where you can really engage with your secondary sources. So let's break that down. In your essay, you have your first paragraph, which is your thesis paragraph. Right? It is when you announce your topic, you define your terms, you come up with your thesis statement, and you tell your readers where you're going to go. You give them a map or an outline of what your argument is going to argue. Okay? So that's your thesis paragraph. It is the same in a non-research paper as it is in a research paper. The second paragraph, however, in a research paper should chart the critical field. So you should survey what other scholars say. You should dedicate a half a page or 3/4 of a page, an entire paragraph, to surveying the topic and the text that you've chosen. So you will say, Stephen Greenblatt, Jean Howard, and Walter Cronkite argue that, and you talk about their sort of group, their agreement, their approach to the text. And then you'll say, however, these 2 scholars take a different approach. And you'll talk for 1 or 2 sentences about their approach. And so you'll basically outline the conversation that has been going on about the text and the topic for at least the last 20 years. In the final few sentences of that paragraph, you will then indicate where you fall in that critical chorus. So you will say, there are gaps in scholarship that have been overlooked, and my research or my argument attempts to fill this critical lacunae. It's a fancy word for saying big holes in the field that I'm looking at. Or, while Greenblatt may have developed this idea in this way, he has failed to fully look at the implications of this particular thing. My argument will address these concerns. So not only are you saying, here's what the big conversation is, here are all what the debates are, here are the sort of major preoccupations of these scholars, but what your preoccupation is, what your interest is. So you're really positioning yourself strongly within this critical course so that we as your readers know where you stand, know where your argument is situated and why it's going to add something new to the conversation around this text or this topic. So that's in the second paragraph of your essay. Throughout your essay, you will be using secondary sources. You can engage with specific ideas and use specific quotations in the body of your essay as you make your argument. So this will be particularly useful for when you've found a scholar who looks at the same passage or the same theme or the same character as you are examining. And so you'll use those quotations specifically throughout your essay in the body paragraphs. If you agree with the scholar, make sure you differentiate between their voice and your voice. Make sure that you articulate that that is their opinion and you agree with that opinion because it's propelling your argument forward. If you don't differentiate between their opinion and your opinion, you run the risk of a charge of plagiarism. Now, if you disagree with this scholar, and sometimes that is even more useful because it provides you with a kind of refutation. It provides you with an alternative perspective that you can then argue against. You should be diplomatic, not Stephen Greenblatt is full of shit, or he did a terrible job of. Be diplomatic. You can say, well, this reading is interesting in this way. I'd like to counter this in this way. So be diplomatic, be generous. Don't be a mercenary in your use of secondary sources. Really be generous and yet autonomous in your perspective. And then finally, in your footnotes. Your footnotes are a wonderful place for you to put ideas, quotations, or scholarship that doesn't really fit in the main body of your essay. So stuff that if you put it in the main body, it would be a digression or it would be tangential, right? So it would go off topic a little bit. The footnote is a beautiful place to put all of those things. So you can say something like, many scholars in the last 10 years have looked at whatever they look at. And if you don't want to list all of those scholars, you put a footnote and you say, see, for example, and you list all of those scholars. Or you can say, I argue that da-da-da. You put in a little footnote and you can say CF. Does anyone know what CF stands for? Compare. So compare my argument with these people's argument. You want to include all of the bibliographical details in your footnote, plus relevant page numbers or a range of pages. If a scholar is talking about this particular idea for 10 pages, you say page 9 to page 19. Okay. You can also put quotations that you think are relevant, that you think will add to the conversation in your footnotes. So footnotes are a wonderful way of putting the things that almost fit but don't quite fit in the main body of your argument. Okay. So a lot of students struggle with the difference between secondary sources and the use of literary theory. So literary theorists are very different than scholarly experts in a particular field. So people like Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Mikhail Bakhtin, Julia Kristeva, these are all literary theorists. They're philosophers. They investigate abstract and theoretical concepts, and they don't address the particular text or topic that you're examining. Please note that if you use literary theory, it doesn't count as secondary research, nor does it count in the number of secondary sources you will be expected to include in your bibliography. So where and how do you use literary theory? If you are nervous about it, and you should be, because it requires a different set of skills than your engagement with secondary sources. It usually shows up in your third paragraph. So if you think about your first paragraph as your thesis paragraph, your second paragraph as the critical chorus that you're charting, if you're using literary theory, and by no means are you expected to do so in any of your English papers, but if you choose to do so, it'll show up in your third paragraph. It'll show up in your third paragraph where you identify the basic principles of the theorist, And then you set up the questions that you are going to ask of the primary text. It is best to limit your focus to one literary theorist. Otherwise, your own argument can be drowned out by a post-structuralist, queer theory, intertextual, dialogic, deconstructionist mess. It gets really confusing when you're trying to balance all of these ideas and synthesize these complicated philosophers into a set of questions that are coherent enough to then apply to a primary text. Understand the limitations of literary theory. One of the worst things that you can do is apply a theory right onto a text without any nuance or complication. And finally, what are primary texts? And we know that primary texts are the texts, for instance, in literature that you are writing about, right? That are in your Norton anthology or in the novel that you're given and assigned for the class. But there are also many other kinds of primary sources that are important for you to use in your research papers. So you might want to use things like historiographies and chronicles. So accounts that are historical about the time period about which you were writing. You might want to look at pamphlets and treatises. You might want to look at homilies and sermons, speeches, records from Parliament, civic documents, letters, marginalia in books. Authors often write in the pages of their books. And that is some scholars' absolute field of expertise, that they read the marginalia, so they read authors reading authors. Catalogs of books or personal items. So we have, if you're interested in Henry VIII, we have huge documents of itemized lists of what is in his wardrobe, what his clothing was, what he got as gifts for New Year's presents. You have hundreds and hundreds of pages of these documents available to you, and you might find a little nugget, a little piece of information that really informs the primary text in literature that you're reading and writing about. So that nuanced research is not just relying on the experts, but also looking at the kind of fields from which your literary text is produced. Okay, so do you now understand the difference between secondary sources, primary sources, and literary theory? Yes? Okay. One of the best pieces of advice I can give you before I talk about the steps, the sort of 7 steps in the process of research and essay writing, is you should know your professor's expectations. If those expectations are not clear, you must put your hand up in class and ask what those expectations are. You should know the page numbers, you should know the word count, you should know the topic, you should know how many secondary sources you will be expected to consult. Now the rule of thumb is usually 1 to 2 secondary sources per page that is assigned. Okay? So if I assign an 8 to 10 page paper, the minimum secondary sources I will expect you to look at, not literary theory, not necessarily primary sources, but secondary sources will be 8, and the maximum, the upper limits, will be 20. Okay, so if you use that ratio in your research papers, that will help you give an understanding of how many secondary sources you should be accumulating. And remember, most of them should be in the last 20 years.